Hello, everyone. It's William Lee with Life on the Magic Mountain, my YouTube series comparing Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, which is 100 years old this year, comparing it with what life was really like in a Davos sanatorium, and in particular, the one that I'm attached to, which is Schatzalp. It is now Hotel Schatzalp. It was Sanatorium Schatzalp. And the Manns were not there. They were at a sanatorium that was lower down. Schatzalp is up on a mountainside above Davos. And so is the one where they stayed at, the Wald Sanatorium, but at a much lower level. So, and in the book it's referred to as the Berghof. So if you watched last week, I thought it was a good topic, but I was not happy with my delivery. I seem to be more sort of inarticulate than usual. I'm not sort of a naturally gifted speaker as it is, but last week I felt like it was even more the case. And so if you're watching this week, having watched that one, then I thank you and I congratulate you on your patience. So I think we have a particularly good one this week. It's called He Tries Out His Conversational French. The he being Hans Castorp, our protagonist, and his conversational French. Well, that is one of Thomas Mann's ironies. He likes to put irony in his titles, and there will be a long conversation in French. In fact, in the H.T. Porter Low or Low Porter translation, the French is left untranslated because at the time that it was done, educated people, for the most part, were able to read, if not to speak French. But French is not so much considered an essential language anymore, alas, and so it's not as widely spoken. And yeah, so in the Wood translation, the John E. Wood translation, that French passage is translated. But this, as I said, is an ironic title because Hans Castorp is not having a conversation in French. He's just saying a few words to this very sad Mexican woman who paces in front of the sanatorium in the garden while her two sons are inside dying. And usually she's at her bedside, but every day she comes out and is out front for a little while, walking back and forth on the gravel paths. You still have the gravel paths today at Schatzalp. And she doesn't speak anything but Spanish, and because she and her sons are the only Spanish-speaking clients at the Berghof at that time, she's really very isolated. And she can only say, if somebody greets her, she can only say tous les deux, meaning both of them, both of my sons, they're both dying. And she just can't get over that sort of fate. So Hans Castorp exchanges a few words with her, and that's it. All right, so we begin this chapter by a remark about how Castorp is able to, or becoming able to, assimilate new things with youthful receptivity. A very good quality, of course. He's 23 or 24 years old, and I, too, was in my 20s when I first came to Schatzalp, and I think that did make a big difference in my case. I mean, there are people all the time that are just sort of thunderstruck by Schatzalp, or moonstruck, or however you would want to put it. You go there and you just feel an instant connection and an instant almost joy in being at the place. So if you get a chance, if you haven't, if you get a chance to go give it a try, and if you experience that, then yeah, let me know. There are, I know, a handful of people who have had that reaction, and it never ceases to amaze me, even though I experienced it myself. And I think it's quite possible to go at an older age, not in your 20s, and have that reaction. But in my case, I think it was especially valuable because then I had time and I had the ability at that time, since I was living in London and not back in my native United States on the West Coast, I had the ability to return frequently and to take it all in, and it was sort of part of my formative experience as a young man, and it remains there as really sort of a foundation. So in the case of our friend Grand Duke Dmitri, who was at Schatz Alp from 1939 to 1942, he was already in his 40s. And he was there under circumstances vastly different from my own and from Hans Castorp's, even if Hans Castorp had been a real person, because neither Hans Castorp nor I myself were facing a battle for survival against an often terminal disease. All right, so here's an interesting topic for this week that I like very much, which is what are the things that you see if you're just walking along as a visitor, if you're just walking along the corridors of a private sanatorium, probably a public sanatorium as well, but they were a little different because they were usually, you had wards and not private rooms for the most part. So these sanatoria in Schatz Alp, in Davos, ones like Schatz Alp, and like the Berghof or the Wald Sanatorium, which were very expensive, exclusive places, they tried to present themselves as being, yes, part hospital, but having really the atmosphere and the luxury of a grand hotel. And so people could kind of pretend that they were just there in a resort setting. But there were definitely certain tells that you would know that you weren't actually in a hotel, you were in a sanatorium. And most of the Davos, the former sanatoriums in Davos that have converted into hotels, including the Wald Sanatorium, do not have these things anymore. They've been removed, the places have been modernized, but at Schatz Alp, you do find still signs of the sanatorium if you're just walking down a corridor. And, I suppose there are some people that don't like that, but most of the people that go there seem to appreciate that and seem to like that connection to the past and to history. So what are the things that you would see? Well, when it was a sanatorium and not a hotel, you would see oxygen tanks in the corridors. Not a lot of them, but wherever there was, so the oxygen tank outside the door of a room would be a tip-off that the person inside that room was dying. They were using oxygen at that time only at the end of a person's life. It was very expensive, and the people that were staying there were paying out of pocket, for the most part. Later, much later, towards the end of the sanatorium era, there were indeed people using insurance, but at that time people were paying mainly out of pocket. A lot of them were wealthy, but the doctors weren't really recommending oxygen or oxygen therapy for people who were not in the last stage of the disease, and indeed for people who weren't moribund or bedridden. And so Hans Castorp says that these cost 6 francs per bottle, which, if you compare that to the price of the rooms, was, pretty high cost, about let's see, you have rooms that cost 10 francs a day up to about 27 francs a day. So even the more expensive rooms, you're talking about, you know, a big additional cost. But anyway, these were, as described by Thomas Mann through Hans Castorp, balloon-shaped containers with short necks, so not the sort of ones that look like scuba tanks that we're more used to today. And what is another thing that you would see? Well, at Schatzalp, Thomas Mann doesn't mention this, but at Schatzalp you will find nurses call buttons, both in the corridor and in the rooms. And some of them have, some of them have 3 buttons. It's a little sort of placard on the wall that has, some of them have 3. The ones that have 3 have a little image of a nurse next to one button, a little image of a waiter, and a little image of a maid. So you could ring if you wanted a snack, or if you wanted something, you know, you had spilled a drink or something and you wanted a maid to come outside of the usual time, or you needed a nurse. So you will find these not only in the rooms, but you will find these when you're walking down the corridors at Schatzalp. And some of them are just a nurse. Some of them don't have the images, so I guess, you know, they were installed at different times, but they're all from the sanatorium era. And you also have this sort of triangular illuminated sign that has different categories that will light up when it's time for meals, because, you know, you had several meals a day at a tuberculosis sanatorium with the idea of people should gain weight as part of the treatment. So you have those. You have spit sinks in the corridors. So these are actually quite lovely considering what they were used for. So they weren't to spit into, but people in sanatoriums were required to have these little flasks or bottles called Blauer Heinrich, a blue Henry, and most of them were made of blue glass with a lid on top. Although if you wanted to, you could buy a fancier one made out of silver. I've never seen one made out of gold, but maybe they existed. And, you know, when you're bringing up what's in your lungs, you spit into those. They were very, very worried about contagion back then, about contagion specifically from dried sputum, which wasn't really a thing, but that was something that they were very much afraid of, and they seem to have looked at that as the primary means of communication of the disease from one person to another, and it was really nonsense, but that was the precaution that they took. So these sinks are of a special size with the faucet, with the tap, to clean out these spit flasks. And towards the end of the sanatorium, you had something that was actually more hygienic. You had these little cardboard disposable containers that nobody had to, you know, clean out. Gross, right? You could just throw those away, or you would throw them away and then they would be taken down to the incinerator and burned. But you are going to see those spit sinks in the corridors at Schatzalp. They're beautiful. They're made of, I believe, marble. I'm not an expert on stone. And then they're surrounded by some beautiful Dutch tile. So you'll definitely want to have a look at those. So what's another thing that you would have seen that you don't see at Schatzalp today, but that you would have seen back then? Well, you would have seen nurses. So you had nurses who were employed by the sanatorium, and you had nurses who were private nurses who were hired by individual patients. Sometimes they brought a nurse with them. Sometimes they hired them in town. And if you look at the Davoser Blätter, a local paper that was specifically for people who came to Davos either for winter sport or for treatment, then you'll see ads that people have put in the paper, women, advertising that they're available either as private nurses or as sanatorium nurses. So in the Magic Mountain, Thomas or Hans Castorp and Joachim have an encounter with a nurse, Sister Bertha, and her real name is Alfreda Schildknecht, and she's one of, there are a few nurses that they meet. This one is a private nurse. So she is usually called in. She tells us when a person is bedridden and dying, and she stays with that person till the end, around the clock care, and then she moves on to another patient. But her whole thing is that she is a woman of good family. The author tells us she comes from the educated strata of society, and she wants everybody to know that. For her, working for a living, even in a position like nurse that you had to be trained for and have a pretty high level of training, she still was working, and she wanted people to know. It was very important to her that she came from an educated strata of society. And the other affliction that Sister Bertha had was that the author tells us she was a woman whose reason had long suffered the tortures of boredom. So, she's not really with patients, interesting patients, like, say, with Dimitri, for instance, that she could, maybe play a hand of cards with or hear fascinating stories from. She's with people who are dying, and she's done it possibly for decades, and she's just bored. And so the comical element of it in the book is that Hans Castorp and Joachim always try to avoid her, because if she succeeds in stopping you for a minute to chat, then she just doesn't want to let you go. She just tries to come up with new topics so that she can keep you there and have a nice long conversation. And you finally just have to say, it's kind of like a salesperson that comes to the door. You finally just have to say, sorry, I can't, I'm busy, whatever, and try and get away from her. So the poor thing. And then she tells them that she would only move on to it, that, life, her prospects for the future were quite gloomy as she saw them. She would only move on to another patient in a more or less advanced stage of the illness, here or at some other sanatorium. Such were her prospects, and no others would ever open before her. So this was not a vocation for poor Sister Bertha. This was a job. And, so we call, at that time, lay women who were nurses were nonetheless called sister, going, back to the tradition of nuns being the caregivers for the sick. All right, so now Dimitri tells us very little about his nurse, only when he first arrives. And, to begin with, he didn't bring a nurse with him. He would not have had a private nurse. This nurse that was assigned to him his first day at the sanatorium, she didn't have to do a lot. She just got him into bed was the main thing that she did. And I'm sure you've heard about me mention her before, and also, I talk about her on the history blog on the Schatzalp website, the Hotel Schatzalp website. So the funny thing about his nurse was that she had a mustache. Not that that's funny in itself, good for her, but that it links her to a story about a mysterious nurse at Schatzalp who not only had a mustache, but was very, very large and had hands and feet the size of a man's hands and feet, and also behaved strangely because she would pace back and forth outside of the room of the patient that she was attached to, and she was a private nurse. So, there are some incongruities there. Dimitri's nurse was not a private nurse, and she wasn't extra large. I think he would have mentioned that. And if she was pacing back and forth in the corridor, it was probably because, like poor Sister Berta, she was just restless and bored. But he liked her very much, and he compared her to a Russian peasant nanny. Okay, so now we come to the more philosophical part of the book. And this time we have a contrast between the doctor, the head doctor or chef arzt Hofrat Behrens, and what he is emphasizing about DeVos, and we have Hans Castorp himself and what he sees, what he focuses on, and what he emphasizes about DeVos and about being in a sanatorium. So here's this excellent book, which you should all read, Erich Kästner's Der Zauberlehrling, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and this is a brilliant book from, I believe, 1927 or 1928, and it was written almost as a kind of a response to the Magic Mountain highlighting, of course, the sanatorium, and this book, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, highlights DeVos as a world-class winter sport resort. So, and it's very funny, it's humorous, it's small, as you can see. Unfortunately, it has not been translated into English. I don't know if it's been translated into French or any other languages, but it's pretty, if you're an intermediate German speaker or reader, you should be able to handle it. I mean, I am, and I was able to read it and enjoy it. Okay, so what is Director Behrens or Chef Arzt Behrens interested in? He is interested in talking about the glitter and glamour of DeVos as a winter sport resort and also a summer resort. So he tells Hans Castorp, yes, our summer season's quite the thing, of very good parentage. It cost me a pretty penny to puff it up a bit, too. So originally, people came to DeVos only for the winter, whether it was for sports, tobogganing, bobsledding, and later skiing, or whether it was for the cure. They were told that the cold, brisk, pure mountain air and the pine forests were very curative for tuberculosis. And so in the summer, they would often go off to some other place. And there was even this nonsensical story that it was unhealthy in DeVos in the summer because you would have the melting snow putting more moisture, humidity into the air. You would have a wind that wasn't healthy, and so people would leave. And that was complete nonsense, but boy, did they have trouble trying to convince people of that at first. You know, people would go off to to watering places or to desert sanatoriums and then come back in the winter. So when Behrens says that it cost me a pretty penny to puff it up a bit, well, they had to do constant advertising and write-ups about how scientifically it was nonsense to say that it was unhealthy in the summer. So some of the doctors, I'm told that this was one of the things that, true things that Thomas Mann incorporated into the Magic Mountain, was that some of the doctors got together and decided that they were, come hell or high water, so to speak, they were going to accomplish this task of convincing people that DeVos was great for the summer season. And it is, to this day, it's wonderful for the summer season. I used to go when I moved back to the U.S. and I could only, it was a really big deal to go from the West Coast all the way to Europe and to Switzerland. I would only go for 2 weeks and only in the winter. And I love to be there in the snow and in the winter, but the summer is just glorious. And these days I come usually at the very end of the winter season around Easter time and stay until July typically. And, I love having the taste of winter when I first arrive. And also, this year in May, we had a lot of snow, really a lot of snow. You could hardly believe some of the pictures I have. I wish I could show them here of, tromping through the snow. But so you usually get both, but once summer sets in, oh my God, it's truly glorious. So if you have a chance to come and experience both the summer and the winter seasons, you will have a great time, I can assure you. Okay, so what does Behrens then say about the winter season? He says, the international creme de la creme down in Plots doesn't arrive until winter, and you really must see them. Excuse me, just for educational purposes. Split your sides watching these lads leaping about on planks tied to their feet, and the ladies, Lord, the ladies. Regular birds of paradise, I tell you, and eminently amorous. So you still have these two very glamorous and glittering winter sport resorts in Switzerland. In Canton Graubünden, you have St. Moritz, of course, and you have Davos. And St. Moritz is definitely more flashy. It was the place that the Russian oligarchs liked to go to back when they still could, and you would see lots of, fur coats and things like that. Davos is, it's still, Davos cloisters, they still continue to attract royalty, as they did back during the sanatorium, when you would have the King of Belgium and the King of Thailand or Siam and various other people like that. People that, maybe wanted a little less of the sort of forced glamour of St. Moritz. I don't know if I should really say it was forced glamour, but you would have had more of that element of people who wanted to just go to be seen that they were there in St. Moritz than in Davos, probably. And, Dmitri and his wife, when he was married, from 26 to 36, I believe the divorce was finalized in 36, they would go for the winter season to St. Moritz. And I'm sure they went to Davos, maybe because he was really into the bobsledding. And bobsledding was sort of starting to die out in that Davos by 1927. You have, and you still have the bobsled runs in St. Moritz. Well, Davos had an absolutely world-class bobsled run as well, with lots of important championships and competitions. But skiing really took over in the 1920s. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Dmitri and his wife would ever have gone specifically to Davos for the bobsledding. Maybe not. But anyway, as I said, the Kestner book gives you the full picture of glamorous Davos and winter sport Davos. Okay, well, Hans Castorp isn't into any of that. He does try skiing on one occasion, but that is the winter sport. He doesn't want to mix with the tourists and with the winter sport people. He goes off on his own when he goes skiing. And what he loves about Davos and about the Berghof in particular is its romanticized connection to death, because he's got this sort of death wish and death obsession. Even though he's really a very healthy young man, he pretends to have TB, and the doctor supports him in that pretense to a certain extent, and they sort of pretend together that he has TB, which he doesn't. Okay, so here's what he says. Okay, so the chapter actually opens with him getting a glimpse behind one of the doors. When the door opens in one of these rooms that has the oxygen tank out in front of it, and he sees this dying young man with big solemn eyes, and he's just really smitten by that. And the novel says this was the first moribundus that Hans Castorp had ever seen in his life, inasmuch as both his parents and his grandfather had died behind his back, so to speak. So they died when he was a small child, and so he was kept away from them when they were dying, and he only saw them in their coffins, and he was very much impressed by how they looked, so dignified and peaceful in their coffins, and that set the tone for this preoccupation of his for the rest of his life. And if any of you, like myself, have had the unfortunate task of sitting by the bedside of a dying person, a dying loved one, then you know that it is far from a romantic experience. And okay, so he makes the statement to his cousin. He says, I get along with sad people better than with happy ones. God only knows why. Perhaps because I am an orphan. Yeah, I think so. I think it's also because Hans Castorp has been a rather lonely person. He's only really kind of connected with people in a superficial way. And now at the sanatorium, he's going to make some really deep connections. He's going to get to know his cousin Joachim better. He's going to have the mentor, Herset and Brini, and he finally is going to form some really deep relationships and connections. And of course, not to leave out Frau Chauchat. All right, excuse me, I've still got a head cold. Okay, then he says, I was thinking only recently that it's really foolish the way the local ladies carry on about death and things connected with it, that everyone is so skittish, protecting them and making sure the last rites are brought while they're downstairs eating. No, phooey, that's silly. Don't you love to look at coffins? I've always enjoyed looking at one now and then. I think of a coffin as an absolutely lovely piece of furniture, even when it's empty, and if there's someone lying in it, it's really quite sublime in my eyes. So going back to protecting people, particularly the ladies, as he puts it, from death, from the presence of death in a sanatorium, yeah, most people don't want to be reminded, especially if they're truly sick themselves, about death and dying. So the sanatoriums did take, they tried to do things behind the scenes as much as was possible. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people who went, more people than you would think, and definitely the majority of people who went and spent time as patients in sanatoriums did not die. A lot of times, like Hans Castorp himself, they were misdiagnosed with tuberculosis, or they knew they didn't have it and they went there just to recuperate from a bad bout of pneumonia or something like that. And so, as much as I've been able to track the patients at Schatzalp through the published guest list, I've seen that so many of them then went on and lived to, their 60s, 70s, 80s, having been quite young people when they entered the sanatorium. So, I was trying to remember, since I'm going back through the book myself as we go along and do this, I should know it by heart. I've read it so many times, but I was trying to remember how many people that Hans Castorp meets early on in the book actually end up dying. And spoiler, his cousin dies, so that's one. And there's a man named Herr Blumenkohl who sits at Hans Castorp's table who ends up dying, and it's clear from the very first meal that Hans Castorp has there that he is going to very soon have to take to his bed and not get up again. But other than that, there's one friend of Hans Castorp's who is considered moribundus on his deathbed, but then he recovers. And yeah, Frau Stur, this very vulgar woman, I think she's there for the whole 7 years that Hans Castorp is there, and she doesn't get any worse. She's at every meal. So, by and large, you weren't surrounded by death to the extent that one would assume. And, so people were skittish about talking about it. There's one occasion in the novel when Hans Castorp brings up something to do with death, and Frau Stur just has an absolute fit about that. And how can you be so cruel, and how can you be so, so callous? And so they like to talk about their illnesses, and she in particular, when somebody like Herr Blumenkohl is clearly dying, she likes to, make allusions to that, kind of mean allusions to that. But, you know, it was there, it was part of life in a sanatorium, but you didn't want to emphasize it. Hans Castorp was definitely unusual in wanting to emphasize it to the extent that he does. And what he says about coffins is very interesting. So, referring to them as an item or a piece of furniture, I certainly don't think most people think of them in that sense. And in the last episode, I talked about the Liegestuhl as really being at the core of the rest cure in a tuberculosis sanatorium at that time, and especially in Davos. So the Liegekur was kind of like the sort of lounging deck chair that you would have on an ocean cruise. So it's a chair that can fully recline, and that was where the patients had obligatory cure time or rest cure time every day, up to about, one of them was from 2 to 4 every day, and they would have 2 or more of these, and the 2 that were basic and mandatory. And so last week I was comparing the Liegestuhl as something sort of parallel to the coffin in, 2 sides of the same coin, as it were. The positive sign that's associated with getting better, and the negative sign, obviously, that's associated with the failure of the cure if you end up in a coffin. Then I was thinking today about other novels that have coffins as an important item of furniture, but symbolically important. And the first one that sprang to mind was Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, the famous Russian novel, and both in the movie and in the book you have this opening scene with the burial of the young Zhivago's mother when he's still a child, and the open grave and throwing dirt onto the coffin. And it makes me think about Hans Castorp's experience when his grandfather dies, of being very little and all dressed in black in this very solemn occasion. Okay, the next one I was thinking of was the famous American novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville, where one of the most colorful and interesting characters in the novel, Queequeg, he is making his own coffin on this whaling ship, and he's had a premonition, and he does indeed end up dying, and he's making a coffin for himself on board ship, and it doesn't bother him at all. He has this premonition, and he accepts it. Okay, another novel where coffins are very important, Lincoln in the Bardo, where coffins are referred to as sick boxes. So this is quite an experimental novel, a very, very good one. And the Bardo is the word for the Tibetan Buddhist concept of this sort of one part of the afterlife, as I gather, where people are it's kind of like a waiting room. People are kind of in a sort of limbo, but not in the Catholic sense. And so, when one of the first characters talking in the novel talks about having an accident at work and being brought home in a sick box, I thought, well, what the heck is a sick box? And then, of course, you fairly quickly figure out, it's a coffin. So that's an interesting way of referring to a coffin, just like calling it a piece of furniture. Okay, and the other one, the classic, Dracula by Bram Stoker, the 19th century novel about Count Dracula, the vampire, and of course his coffin is extremely important, and he has to bring it by boat from Eastern Europe, from Transylvania in, I think it's Romania now. It has to be brought to London, so part of that is a sea voyage, or to England, I should say, to Whitby, not to London. And that one of the most fantastic parts of the novel is this sea voyage where Count Dracula is emerging at night and killing off one crew member after another, whoever's on watch. And yeah, the coffin, of course, as you would imagine, is very central to that story. Okay, and so then we have this line that I like so much. Hans Castorp says, "I really do like it for people to be a little more devout once in a while. Sometimes I've asked myself if I shouldn't have been a pastor. In some ways, I don't think I would have made a bad one." Okay, so yeah, maybe this is, not only his childhood experience, but another reason why he has this sort of morbid side of him is not morbid per se. It's because he likes a little bit of formality and a little bit of solemnity in his life. And I can understand that as a Greek Orthodox Christian. When I go to the Good Friday, the afternoon Good Friday service, where an image of Christ is taken down from the cross and it's carried, draped in the epitaphion, the grave cloth, and then in the evening there's a big procession around the whole church, a candlelight procession, and I always enjoy it more and am more touched by it if people are in the right mood for it. So it kind of has this feeling of being like a funeral for everyone, not just a funeral for Christ going into the void. But a lot of times, people are having a good time. They're laughing and chatting and looking at their phones while they're making the procession. And okay, yeah, I can agree with Hans Castorp that it's nice to have a little solemnity in life sometimes. It doesn't have to be connected with death. That's an unfortunate connection. So as I said before, Hans Castorp does not have the perspective of a dying person at a sanatorium. I don't have the perspective of a dying person, what that would have been like at a sanatorium. And, so I have to refer to what Dmitri said very touchingly in his diary. At one point, he writes very simple words: "I don't want to die here." So it's particularly sad that he did, but that, of course, colored his experience of being in a sanatorium. When you come to the hotel, Schatzalp, you will not find that atmosphere at all. As I say, it's an atmosphere that some people come to, and the energy is so positive. I'm not sure why. There are theories about that if you yourself are well and healthy, or if you're recuperating, you are not going to have that experience. So don't worry about that. I didn't mean to go so long today, but I really enjoyed this one in particular, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.